So now we're going to get into our first real lecture for this semester. And the way that you should handle these online lectures is that you should take notes. You should get a gigantic notebook because there'll be a lot of notes. And you should just take notes as if you were in real class. The best way to learn something is to write it down. And when you write down your notes, it actually sticks in your brain. And as you'll see, I post some review questions throughout the lecture, and you can write down your answers while we're going. So the first thing we're going to go over is we're going to go over the chemical basis of life, or basically the chemistry of life. In order to understand the chemistry of life, the first thing we have to talk about is the periodic table of elements. And you probably saw this before. You probably saw it in second grade. And guess what? It hasn't changed. It still looks exactly the same. Now for this class, you only need to memorize elements 1 through 118. So you'll just memorize all of those elements and their abbreviation. Well, what you should know, though, about the periodic table of elements is all of these elements make up what's called matter. And matter is basically anything that is in the planet or in our solar system or in the world. It's just anything that takes up space. It can be a solid, a liquid, or a gas. So all of these elements make up matter. And these elements are the smallest thing. They can't be broken down into any other substance. So these are what make up all of our life and all of our non-life. However, the elements that do make up life are really important because this is a biomolecular science class, so we're going to be talking about life. So what you should know are the 6 main elements that make up all of life, including humans, animals, plants, bacteria, whatever. We're all made up of the 6 main elements. And these elements are, number 1, carbon. Carbon is the most essential element of all life, and it's abbreviated C. C is carbon. The second is hydrogen. Hydrogen is abbreviated H. Carbon and hydrogen usually go hand in hand. Usually when you see a carbon, you're definitely going to see a hydrogen as well. The third main element of life is oxygen. Oxygen is abbreviated O. The fourth one is nitrogen, which is abbreviated N. The fifth main element of life is phosphorus, which is abbreviated with a P. And the sixth main element of life is sulfur, which is abbreviated with an S. So if you ever want to remember the 6 elements of life, that's all you have to remember is that it spells chomps. Okay, it sounds like chomps, but there's an N instead of an M. So you could think of a little Pac-Man guy here chomping away at some food. So that's the 6 elements that make up the majority of our body and our cells. If you look back at this picture from the last slide, you can see in the human body, oxygen is about 65% of our body because water is really important and our body's mostly water, and water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen. So you have about 65% oxygen, about 10% hydrogen, 18% carbon, 3% nitrogen. And you can see phosphorus and sulfur are in low amounts. Depends on the organism. Now, there are some other elements that are in your body that are in really small amounts. Therefore, we call these the trace elements because you need small amounts of them in your diet to make up parts of your body. So you could probably think of some like calcium. You guys probably know calcium is really important for your bones and your teeth, and you need to get that in your diet. Iron, right? Iron really important for your blood, and you need to get iron in your diet. You guys know where you can get a lot of iron is through meat, especially red meat or beans if you're a vegetarian. You also need magnesium. You need potassium. I'll let you guys think of some other ones. Oh, sodium. You definitely need sodium. Hey, do you guys know the abbreviation for sodium? It's Na, okay? Na is sodium. And by the way, iron is Fe and calcium is Ca. So some of these elements have 2-letter abbreviations instead of 1. So all of these elements are made up of atoms. And a lot of times we use atom or element interchangeably. So like hydrogen is an element and it's also the name of the atom. So atoms are made up of 3 subatomic particles. And you have certainly seen these before, but let's review. They're made up of, first, neutrons. Neutrons have no charge, so they're neutral. Secondly, atoms are made up of protons. Remember, protons have a positive charge. P for positive, protons for positive. And the third is electrons, and electrons have a negative charge. In order to find out how many protons, neutrons, and electrons an atom has, it's really easy. That's all you have to do is look at the atomic number. If you go to the periodic table, you'll find the atom you're interested in, like carbon. The atomic number is always above it. So carbon has an atomic number of 6. So what that tells you is that under normal conditions, carbon, it has an atomic number of 6. So what that means is under normal conditions, carbon is going to have 6 neutrons, 6 protons, and 6 electrons. Whatever the atomic number is, that's how many protons, electrons, and normally how many neutrons are going to be in that element. All right, so I'll give you another example. Hydrogen has an atomic number 1. So that means hydrogen has 1 neutron, 1 proton, and 1 electron. If you're ever unsure what the atomic number is, it's really easy. You just look at your periodic table, and this is the periodic table I'm normally going to show you, like on an exam or whatever. I'll just show you this really simple periodic table. So you're going to look at the periodic table. Hydrogen is number 1. It's the first one on the periodic table. So you know it's atomic number 1, and it says 1. Helium is number 2. So that means helium has 2 neutrons, 2 electrons, 2 protons. As you can see, the main ones you need to know: H, the carbon, which is 6, nitrogen, which is 7, oxygen is 8, and then remember, phosphorus and sulfur are the other 2 major elements, and they are 15 and 16. In a little while, we're going to be talking about ionic bonds and salts and stuff, so you're also going to want to know sodium, which is 11, and chlorine, which is 17. Now, the other number you're going to see on the periodic table, you see this one at the top. This is the atomic number. Then you see this weird number at the bottom. This is what's called the atomic mass. The atomic mass is the number of neutrons plus the number of protons. So for example, carbon has 6 neutrons plus 6 protons. So its atomic mass is normally 12. As you can see here, 12. All right, so that's what the atomic mass tells you. It tells you the number of neutrons plus the number of protons. Now, sometimes an element could have an abnormal number of neutrons. So remember I told you carbon, which is an atomic number of 6, normally will have 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. But sometimes there's these weird carbons out there, and they're not just like normal. These are radioactive substances. So, stuff you don't want to mess around with on a day-to-day basis. So radioactive substances, or isotopes, is an element that has an abnormal number of neutrons. So for example, carbon-13 has an atomic mass of 13 instead of 12 because there's an extra neutron. Instead of 6 neutrons, carbon-13 has 7 neutrons. Even more dangerous is carbon-14, which has 2 extra neutrons, has 8. And you do not want to mess around with this guy. It's dangerous. However, isotopes can actually be used in real life for a lot of things. We can actually use them in the medical field. If you've ever heard of a PET scan, we use isotopes for PET scans in order to visualize, okay? Because isotopes, like I said, are radioactive, they emit radiation, so we can actually use them in the medical field. And if you pause here, you can view this video, all right? I put the link on the PowerPoint. I also put the link here on our Blackboard page, how PET scans work. It's like 60 seconds, so you can take a pause here and watch this PET scan video real quick. Other things to note about isotopes is because they do emit radiation. Radiation is a carcinogen, so too much exposure to isotopes can actually cause damage to our cells, and they could actually lead to cancer. But because isotopes do damage DNA, we can actually use them to sterilize medical equipment and try to clear them of any bacteria or viruses. So we can use isotopes for a number of things, even though they're a little bit dangerous or really dangerous, and you don't want to get too much exposure to them. I put these little mini review questions throughout the PowerPoint. And what I recommend you do is pause the video and just quickly answer these questions in your notebook. And these are some of the questions that I'm going to go over in class on Tuesday. I'm going to ask you guys these questions, and I'm going to ask some of the questions to the in-person students, and I'm going to ask some of the questions to the online students. So if you already have the answers ready, you'll be all set and ready to go. Remember I told you that atoms are made up of three things. They're made up of neutrons, protons, and electrons. Well, let's take a minute and try to visualize where all of these different subatomic particles are located in each of the atoms. So let's start with my favorite element. Let's start with carbon as our example. Right? We know carbon has atomic number of 6. So what I would do whenever I give you one of these problems is the first thing you're going to do is you're going to write the number of neutrons, the number of electrons, and the number of protons. So I'm going to give you carbon, and you're going to write carbon has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. All right, so you're going to just write that first, because if you don't, everyone's going to get confused. I know it seems silly. Okay, the next thing you need to know is where are the protons? Okay, there's 6 protons. 1, 2, remember the protons have a positive charge. 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so the protons are all hanging out together. They're all best friends, and they're hanging out in the center of the atom is something that's called the nucleus. So the nucleus is where you'll find the protons. This is not the same thing as nucleus that's in a cell. I don't know why they couldn't think of a different word, but yeah, so nucleus is what they called it. So all the protons are together in the nucleus. Also, all of the neutrons are together in the nucleus. So there's 6 of those. And you know what? You do not have to draw the nucleus every time. I'm just kind of showing you as an example. Okay, so protons and neutrons are together here in the nucleus. Now, the electrons are really mean. They do not like the protons. I don't know why. They don't want to hang out in the nucleus with the protons and the neutrons. So the electrons are going to be kind of floating around outside here in what we call electron shells. So electron shells are these electrons floating around the nucleus, while the nucleus is where we find the protons and the neutrons. So I'm just going to draw these electron shells here like around the nucleus, but in real life you can't see the electron shells. They don't have any, they're not like a thing. You don't see them. So here's a new rule, okay? So write this down, your rule. Number 1. The first electron shell, the most inner electron shell, holds a maximum of 2 electrons. That's all that will fit. Okay, so I draw the electrons like these little dots. These dots here are electrons. There's 1 and there's 2. That's all that can fit in the first shell. But remember, carbon has 6. So we need to put 4 more electrons in this atom. So what you're going to need is to draw a second electron shell around the first. And here is your second rule. The second, and if you need a third, the second or third electron shells can hold a maximum of 8 electrons. Okay, so for this carbon molecule, as I said, there's 6 total electrons. We did 1, 2. Now we'll put the remaining 4 on the second shell. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And there is carbon. You've just drawn carbon. That is so cool. Now practice drawing carbon in your notebook. Even though I draw these electrons in the shell like this, all right, they doesn't look like they're moving. It looks like they're just stationary. In real life, the electrons are actually moving around the nucleus. So in real life, the nucleus here in the middle with the protons and neutrons, and really electrons are moving around constantly in the whatever shell they're in. Now, pause the video and try drawing nitrogen. Try practicing your drawing of nitrogen. Just do it, okay? Pause the video and practice your nitrogen, and let's see how good you do. Okay, so if you looked at nitrogen, you saw that nitrogen had atomic number of 7. That means it had 7 neutrons, 7 protons, and 7 electrons. And hopefully you wrote that down first. Now, if you wanted, you could have drawn the 7 neutrons and protons here in the nucleus, but I just wrote N for nitrogen in the middle. But the most important thing is that you put the electrons in the right place. So you put 1 electron, 2, and then you had to do a second shell, and you had 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So hopefully your nitrogen looked something like this, probably better, because as you can see, I have the handwriting of a 5-year-old. Okay, so there's another term that you need to know, and that term is called the valence shell. So the valence shell is the outermost shell, the outermost electron shell, I should say. So for example, in nitrogen here, this outside shell held 5 electrons. So that means the nitrogen valence shell holds 5 electrons in it. So that's what the valence shell is, the outermost shell. Now here's a new rule. This is a really important rule. Make sure you write it down. And the rule is all elements they really, really want, it's their only goal. They have a really bad life. Their only goal in life is to get a full valence shell, okay? So nitrogen's only goal in life is to get 1 more electron here and 2 more electrons over here, because remember, the second shell can hold up to 8 electrons. Right now it only has 5. So nitrogen really is sad. It wants 3 more electrons. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how nitrogen can actually get 3 more electrons and just finally be a little bit happy. Right now it's miserable. This picture is important because it shows you what all of the main elements of life look like. All right, so remember, hydrogen is number 1 on the periodic table, so it only has 1 electron shell with 1 lonely little electron in it. Carbon, we already drew nitrogen. Here's oxygen, another really important one, so, learn that one for sure. And phosphorus and sulfur, as you can see, we had to do a 3rd shell because they're kind of big. So what I'm going to do in class on Tuesday is we're going to practice drawing some of these elements. So make sure you know what you're doing and you know how to do it, and you'll be great.